On the 1st of September 1939, the world watched an army it could not understand. Poland was gone in 27 days. France held out for 44. Nations that had spent years constructing fortified lines crumbled in weeks while their generals were still drawing arrows on maps. The popular explanation has always been that the Wehrmacht won through sheer numbers or superior hardware. Neither is true. France had more tanks. The Soviet Union had more soldiers, and by an enormous margin. So why did it keep happening? Because the Wehrmacht fought differently. Not with better steel, but with better thinking. 9 tactical concepts that turned a conventional military force into something the world had not encountered since the age of Napoleon. When German armored columns pushed through the Ardennes on the 10th of May 1940, the French High Command was certain it was a diversion. The Ardennes was dense forest, broken terrain, no roads worth the name. No rational commander would funnel armored divisions through that. That was exactly the reasoning that left it garrisoned with second-rate units and outdated equipment. That was exactly where the blow landed. The core of what would later be called Blitzkrieg was not the power of the strike, but the location of it. German operational doctrine demanded that commanders find the point of least resistance, concentrate the maximum density of armor on the narrowest possible frontage, and punch through the enemy line the way a needle punctures a balloon. What followed was not a battle, but a race. Tanks drove deep into the enemy rear without stopping to mop up encircled infantry. The infantry could wait. The real targets were headquarters, communications hubs, and fuel depots. The goal was not to destroy the body, but to kill the mind. There is one technical detail that gets overlooked almost every time this campaign is discussed. French tanks in 1940 were, on average, better machines than their German counterparts. The heavy Char B-1 carried thicker armor and a more powerful gun than the Panzer I or Panzer II. On paper, France should have won any armored engagement. They did not, for a single reason. Every German tank carried a radio. German commanders coordinated in real time, hunting in formation the way wolves move through a forest. French commanders relayed orders through motorcycle messengers. By the time a courier arrived, the situation had changed 3 times over. Aviation compounded the advantage. The Junkers Ju-87 dive bomber, known to Allied troops as the Stuka, was fitted with siren housings on its landing gear, deliberately engineered noise devices that screamed during the dive. The sound had been designed as a psychological weapon. Soldiers hearing it for the first time lost the ability to act rationally before the bomb reached the ground. No unit illustrated what this doctrine meant in practice more clearly than the 7th Panzer Division under Major General Erwin Rommel. During the French campaign, it drove through the Ardennes, crossed the Meuse River under fire, and broke out toward the coast at a speed that outpaced not only the enemy, but Rommel's own chain of command. Army Group Headquarters temporarily lost track of where the 7th Panzer was. It materialized where no one expected it, destroyed rear areas, and vanished forward. The French gave it a name. They called it the Ghost Division. The word Blitzkrieg never appears in a single Wehrmacht field manual. British journalists coined the term in September 1939 while trying to explain to readers how Poland had collapsed so fast. German officers used a far more prosaic term for what they were doing. They called it war of maneuver. The underlying idea was simple. Speed is the best armor, and panic inside an enemy headquarters kills more effectively than any artillery battery ever could. Blitzkrieg punched the hole. But that left entire armies stranded behind the breakthrough. Pursuing them was inefficient, and circling them was annihilation. The German encirclement doctrine, known as Kesselschlacht, was geometrically precise. Two armored fists did not strike at the enemy front. They drove on converging axes deep into the enemy rear, swung toward each other, and linked up behind the opposing force, severing its supply lines and every route of retreat. An army became a prison with no walls. The men were still standing, still armed, still fighting in some cases, but going nowhere. The doctrine reached its most devastating expression during the Kiev encirclement in September 1941. The 2nd Panzer Group under Heinz Guderian had been redirected south from the drive toward Moscow. Simultaneously, the 1st Panzer Group under Ewald von Kleist was pushing north from the Ukrainian steppe. On the 14th of September, their forward elements met near the town of Lokvitsia. The ring closed. Inside it were 4 Soviet armies. German figures claimed 665,000 prisoners, a number the Wehrmacht publicized to the world. Russian historians put the actual count of encircled troops closer to 450,000. Whichever figure is closer to the truth, the scale of the collapse was unprecedented. An entire front, the Southwestern Front, ceased to exist. Its commander, Colonel General Kirponos, was killed trying to break out. Roughly 21,000 men managed to escape the pocket. Everyone else was either captured or dead. Being trapped inside a Kessel followed a predictable sequence. Supply failed first. Then communications deteriorated. Then command authority dissolved as units lost contact with one another and with higher headquarters. The Luftwaffe shifted from supporting the advancing spearheads to patrolling the ring, bombing any organized attempt to break through from the inside. Units that tried to punch out in formed groups hit minefields that had been laid on the flanks well before the encirclement was complete. The strategic value of the Kessel went beyond the prisoner count. A destroyed army leaves a gap in the line that nothing can immediately fill. Rebuilding the divisions lost at Kiev took months, and the front had to be held today, not in 3 months when the replacements finished training. Every encirclement that succeeded did not just remove men from the equation. It removed time, and time was the one resource the Soviet Union needed most in 1941. While tanks were redrawing the map of Europe, a quieter revolution was happening at the level of the individual infantry squad. It began with a deceptively simple question. What should a rifle section be built around? In the American, British, and Soviet armies, the answer was the same. Around the rifleman. The machine gun supports the attack, covers the flank, pins the enemy while the infantry maneuvers. Useful, but secondary. The Wehrmacht reached the opposite conclusion. In German doctrine, the squad existed so that the machine gun could fire. The riflemen with their carbines were there to protect the gunner and carry his ammunition. The machine gun was not a support weapon, it was the entire point. And the weapon that embodied this philosophy was the MG-42. Allied soldiers had a name for the sound it made. They called it Hitler's buzzsaw. American Brownings and British Brens fired at a steady, recognizable rhythm, somewhere around 500 rounds per minute, with the heavy mechanical stutter that infantry on both sides learned to gauge and respond to. The MG-42 fired 1,200 rounds per minute, 20 rounds every second. The human ear could no longer distinguish individual shots. What it heard was a continuous tearing sound, like canvas being ripped apart at speed, a noise so unlike anything soldiers had trained against that entire platoons froze before the first man was hit. But the rate of fire was not the most important innovation. The most important was the principle of universality. Other armies built separate machine guns for separate roles, a light version for the squad, and a heavier version for sustained defensive fire. The Germans built one weapon that handled both. Mounted on its lightweight bipod legs, the MG-42 functioned as an assault machine gun, mobile and fast. Transferred onto the heavy Lafette tripod mount with its optical sight, it became a sustained fire weapon capable of engaging targets beyond 2,000 meters and walking rounds across a designated sector with mechanical precision. One receiver, one belt feed, two entirely different weapons depending on how you mounted it. The penalty for the high rate of fire was barrel heat. German crews drilled the barrel change until it was a reflex, completing it in a matter of seconds without burning their hands and without giving up the firing position. Every soldier in the squad, regardless of his designated role, could perform this exchange. If the gunner was killed, the weapon did not go silent. Two MG-42 positions, correctly sited on a defensive line, created an interlocking field of fire with no dead ground. An attacker could not find a patch of earth that was not covered by at least one gun. Going prone was not a solution. After the war, Allied engineers studied the weapon and concluded that the design was so sound it required no fundamental changes. A modified version remains in service in several armies to this day. Blitzkrieg worked in open country. In September 1942, the Wehrmacht ran into Stalingrad, and everything it had learned to do in France and on the Ukrainian steppe suddenly became irrelevant. The city destroyed tanks. Rubble swallowed radio signals. Aircraft could not bomb blocks where the front line ran through a hole in a shared wall. Blitzkrieg was a weapon built on speed, and in Stalingrad, speed was measured in floors. The German answer was the assault group, a small, self-contained combat team that did not seize territory in the conventional sense, but gnawed through it meter by meter. The composition was deliberately mixed. Combat engineers carrying demolition charges, infantrymen armed with submachine guns, a flamethrower operator, grenadiers with as many hand grenades as they could carry. Long rifles were left behind. In tight corridors and basement rooms, they were a liability. The compact MP-40 replaced them, and the basic unit of currency became the hand grenade rather than the aimed shot. The tactical method was uncompromising. The assault group did not advance down the street where defenders could prepare and aim. It went through walls, literally. Engineers blew openings in load-bearing partitions. The team entered a building from a direction no one was watching and cleared it room by room, floor by floor, cellar by cellar. The grenade went through the opening first. The soldiers followed. The flamethrower in these conditions was not primarily a killing tool, though it killed effectively. It was a psychological argument. In the confined darkness of a bunker or a factory workshop, a single operator sending a jet of burning fuel through a narrow passage could clear a defended position without destroying the occupants. The fear of it was more persuasive than the fact of it. One innovation born from pure necessity became a defining feature of urban combat. German assault groups deliberately pressed as close to Soviet positions as possible, sometimes to within a single building. This was called hugging the enemy. The logic was coldly calculated. Soviet artillery on the far bank of the Volga could not fire at the Germans without hitting its own men. The entire weight of firepower that the Red Army had positioned on the eastern bank became useless as long as the front line stayed at grenade-throwing distance. The closer the assault group moved to the Soviet position, the safer it was from the most powerful weapons opposing it. Stalingrad was where assault groups became a mass phenomenon on both sides of the line. Soviet commanders studied the German method and applied it back against the people who invented it. If assault groups were the scalpel, the armored wedge was the sledgehammer. German armored doctrine treated battlefield geometry as a precise science. The chaotic tank avalanche that appears in popular depictions of the war was, to German commanders, a sign of inadequate training. Armored formations moved in carefully calculated shapes. The standard attack formation was the Panzerkeil, the armored wedge, and every element of it served a specific purpose. The heaviest machines held the point. Tigers and Panthers, with their thick frontal armor and long-barreled guns, drew all the incoming fire and absorbed it. A Tiger could take direct hits from rounds that would have burned through any other tank on the battlefield. The Panther's 75mm gun, with its long barrel, could destroy Soviet armor before the opposing crew had closed to effective range. These machines were not hiding. Attracting fire onto themselves was the entire function of their position. Behind them, spreading back and outward like the wings of a bird of prey, came the lighter Panzer IVs. Their task was different, not to absorb punishment, but to destroy anything trying to flank the point. Soviet anti-tank crews attempting to work around the sides of the wedge came under fire from these flanking machines before they could line up a shot. For an enemy artillery crew, this formation presented a mathematically cruel problem. Fire at the point and watch the round deflect off Tiger frontal armor or skip off the angled plate of a Panther. Try to engage the flanks and find that the flanking machines have already acquired you. There was no position from which to engage the wedge and expect favorable odds. At Kursk in July 1943, the Wehrmacht deployed this formation in the largest armored attacks of the entire war. Soviet command knew about the wedge formation in advance and specifically briefed tank crews not to engage the heavy machines head-on. The instruction was to use the T-34's speed advantage to circle wide and strike the sides at a range of 500 meters. What followed was not simply a clash of machines. It was a collision of two competing tactical systems, each designed specifically to defeat the other. By 1943, the Wehrmacht had lost the initiative. The Red Army had learned to fight. Soviet armored formations came in successive waves, and isolated anti-tank guns deployed in the classical manner along trench lines were being destroyed before they managed to fire twice. A crew opened up, revealed their position, and received an answering shell before they could reload. German artillerists changed the rules. Instead of single guns distributed along the line, they concentrated 8 to 10 barrels on a single position under one officer's command. 75mm PaK-40 guns, capable of penetrating the armor of any Soviet tank at ranges up to 800 meters, were emplaced side by side in carefully concealed firing pits. Alongside them, 88mm anti-aircraft guns, adapted for ground use against armor, could engage and destroy any vehicle in the Soviet inventory at 2,000 meters. But the most important element of a PaK front was not the guns themselves. It was the discipline of waiting. Crews were forbidden to fire until the order came. Soviet tanks advanced and the range closed. 1,000 meters, 500, 200. Gunners had targets in their sights. Fingers rested on triggers. The officer watched and said nothing. Only when the tanks were deep inside the engagement zone did the entire line open fire simultaneously. What happened next was not a defensive action. It was an execution. Within seconds, the entire lead element of the Soviet column was under simultaneous fire from 10 guns at different angles. Crews had no time to process where the rounds were coming from before their vehicles were hit. The survivors reversed through smoke and confusion and drove into minefields that had been placed on the flanks of the position before the battle began. This is how, at Kursk, a handful of correctly positioned batteries stopped entire armored corps. A single gun crew was a target. A battery functioning as a single organism with unified command and enforced fire discipline, became a killing machine that individual tank commanders had no tactical answer for. The fundamental problem facing German commanders in the second half of the war was arithmetic. The Red Army was simply larger, and new Soviet formations were being raised faster than attrition could consume the old ones. Hitler's response to this imbalance was the only one he knew. Stand fast, not one step back. Every meter of ground held to the last man. Experienced German generals gave the appearance of complying. Then they quietly invented a different kind of war. They called it elastic defense. The premise was simple and entirely counterintuitive. Instead of holding a rigid line that could be broken by heavy strikes and then exploited, you made the defense elastic, like a strip of rubber that stretches under pressure but snaps back and strikes the hand that pulled it. The forward edge became a trap. The first defensive belt, the outpost zone, was held deliberately thin. A few machine gun positions, scattered observation posts, minimal strength. When Soviet artillery preparation turned it into a lunar landscape, almost no one was in it. The main force had already withdrawn to the principal defensive line before the bombardment began. Soviet infantry rose from their trenches and advanced through fresh craters, believing the defense had been destroyed. But as they moved forward, they lost momentum. Their formation became disordered. Communications stretched back toward their start line. Artillery support was now behind them, and repositioning it forward quickly was impossible. This was the moment the rubber snapped back. Armored reserves held specifically behind the main defensive belt were committed against the flanks of the advancing Soviet infantry. Disorganized, separated from their artillery, spread thin across ground they thought they had already won, the attackers became easy targets in open country. What had looked like a breakthrough became a rout in a matter of hours. The name most directly associated with this method is Manstein, who applied it on the southern sector of the Eastern Front with something close to surgical precision. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad in the winter of '43, it was Manstein who used a series of rapid counterstrikes to retake Kharkov just weeks after Soviet forces had entered the city and declared it liberated. Hitler never fully grasped that his orders to hold at all costs directly contradicted the only thing that was still allowing the Wehrmacht to survive. Sometimes there was nowhere left to retreat. The front collapsed, encirclement closed, and scattered units found themselves deep inside Soviet lines with no supply, no contact, and no way out. The Wehrmacht had an answer for that situation too. Rather than attempting to withdraw through ground that no longer existed, cut-off formations folded into tight, circular perimeters around key points on the map, typically railway junctions, road crossings, or large population centers. Anti-tank guns faced outward in every direction. Machine gun positions covered the approaches around the full perimeter. A unit that had ceased to function as a linear force could still fight, and fight effectively, regardless of which direction the enemy came from. Hitler formalized this tactic of desperation into official doctrine in 1944, designating certain cities as Festungen, fortresses. Garrisons already completely surrounded and cut off from resupply were ordered to hold indefinitely. The strategic logic behind the order was coldly mathematical. A hedgehog position, sitting astride a road junction directly behind the Soviet advance line, could not simply be bypassed. It intercepted the supply routes feeding Soviet armies pushing further west. Neutralizing it required stopping, turning forces around, and committing troops to a siege. That cost time and blood. The Brest fortress, at the start of the war, had shown German planners what a single determined strongpoint could do. One fortified position pinned an entire division for weeks while the main drive rolled forward. By 1944, the Wehrmacht was building those positions deliberately, all along the front, out of the ruins of encircled garrisons. The abandoned garrisons were expendable in the coldest possible accounting. They received no resupply. They had no prospect of relief. They were written off. But each one made the Soviet advance fractionally more expensive, fractionally slower, and in a war where the calendar itself was running out, every day mattered. The grim paradox of the hedgehog was that it worked better the less it won. It did not save an army. It simply forced the victor to pay a slightly higher price for every kilometer. While the ground war played out in trenches, encirclements, and rubble, the Luftwaffe was conducting a revolution in the sky whose consequences outlasted the war, the Reich, and the generation that fought it. At the start of the conflict, British fighter pilots flew in tight formations of 3 aircraft called Vics. Holding that formation demanded constant attention to avoiding collision with the next plane. There was almost nothing left for watching the sky around them. The Luftwaffe did what it wanted against those disciplined formations. German pilots had worked out a different answer in the skies over Spain in 1936. The basic combat unit was the pair. One pilot attacked. His wingman watched the rear and the flanks and kept threats off the leader's tail. Each man performed one task and performed it well. 2 pairs combined into a flight of 4 aircraft with wide, loose spacing between them. Pilots could maneuver freely without collision risk, and every aircraft always had cover. This formation was called the Finger Four because the positions of the 4 aircraft in the air matched roughly the arrangement of the fingertips on an outstretched hand when viewed from above. The division of labor between leader and wingman was almost animal in its simplicity. One hunts, one watches. This gave German pilots a fundamental advantage in situational awareness over any opponent flying tight, parade ground formations, regardless of the quality of the aircraft involved. By 1941, Allied air arms had paid in blood to learn this lesson. The British adopted it. The Americans followed. Soviet fighter regiments transitioned to pairs by 1942. Then came jet aircraft, then guided missiles, then supersonic combat, and entirely different wars over entirely different continents. The Finger Four formation survived all of it, and is still the standard tactical arrangement for fighter aircraft today. 9 concepts. Blitzkrieg and the Kessel, which demolished armies that had been built to fight for years and did it in weeks. The MG-42, which restructured the infantry squad around firepower superiority. Assault groups that taught soldiers to fight by the staircase and the wall rather than the field and the trench. The armored wedge, engineered so that no firing position against it offered favorable odds. The pack front, which turned anti-tank defense from individual gunnery into a coordinated ambush. Elastic defense, which made attacking forces fight an empty space and then a counterpunch from nowhere. The hedgehog, which converted encirclement from a death sentence into a tactical tool. And the Schwarm, 4 aircraft whose formation is still flying over airfields today. The Wehrmacht lost the war. The ideas it generated did not die with the Third Reich. They moved into the military academies and field manuals of the nations that defeated it, and most of them are still there. If you found this video worth your time, hit the like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Drop a comment below and tell us which of these 9 concepts surprised you the most. The next video is already in production.